Hi folks, it's Kira Kazantzis from Silicon Valley Council of Nonprofits, and welcome to the final webinar in our Activate Your Impact Nonprofit Policy Webinar Summit. That is a mouthful. I hope you all have your lunch like me, and you're able to relax, settle in, and ready yourself to hear and ask questions of our panelists who are here to engage in a very important and incredibly timely discussion about race equity in this time of COVID. So why are we talking about policy and equity in the middle of a global pandemic? We know nonprofit organizations already do so much in our community, especially in times of great need like now. And it's also important that every nonprofit use its voice and to lift up community voices to bring lasting positive change for the community we serve. We believe advocacy is a sacred duty of nonprofits, and it should be a core competency. So SVCN, with its partners, is here to help you advance your mission, secure needed resources, and work with you to build an equitable and thriving community. Here's where I thank our sponsors. We're very grateful. Our sponsors stuck with us as we pivoted from an in-person one-day summit to this 5-webinar series. And they are Palo Alto Medical Foundation, Sutter Health, Applied Materials Foundation, El Camino Health, the Health Trust, Housing Authority of Santa Clara County, Santa Clara Family Health Plan, SV at Home, and Valley Medical Center Foundation, and Destination Home. My colleague Jen Turai, who is our Director of Learning and Membership Engagement, is going to explain the logistics of this webinar, and followed after Jen will be our Chief Strategy and Policy Officer, Wendy Ho, who's going to introduce our moderator.
Thank you, Kira. All right, and welcome to everybody who's joining us today. Just some logistics before we get started with this awesome discussion. You can use the Q&A function. You'll see the icon at the bottom of the screen, and use that function to ask your questions. That way we can keep the answers to all of your questions threaded within the same chat. There is no chat function available to participants, so in case you're wondering why you can't talk to other people on the webinar, it's because it is not enabled. There will be a poll, so if you have not used the polling function on Zoom before, it'll pop up and you can just answer the questions. That'll be toward the end of our program. And then after our discussion today, I want you to stay tuned because I have some really important announcements to share with all of you, so I hope you can stick around. And then when I do end up closing the webinar, there will be a prompt to ask if you want to be sent over to a different website. That is actually to send you to our evaluation. So I please urge you to click yes, that you want to go there. And that way I can gather some valuable feedback from all of you about our programming today and to help inform future programs that I plan. Just so everyone knows as well, I will be sending a follow-up email and recordings will be sent out afterward. So keep an eye out for that. And I think those are all of our logistics. So I will pass it over to Wendy now.
Thanks, Jen, and good afternoon to everyone on our webinar this afternoon. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our moderator for today's panel conversation, Jenny Nicholas. She is the Chief Impact Officer for American Leadership Forum here in Silicon Valley. She has 25+ years of impact-based work in our beloved county. Her experience spans working with women and children who are victims of violence, those living with poverty, and older adults. And prior to serving as the Chief Impact Officer for ALF, Jenny was the CEO of Home First Services. And fun fact, you may not know that Jenny is a certified yoga instructor and mindfulness practitioner. And we are so lucky to have her as a member of our leadership team at SVCN. In her work with ALF, Jenny facilitates the diversity, inclusion, equity, and liberation cohorts of nonprofit leaders, which is a place for leaders in the sector to share resources and be in dialogue with each other about how to center race equity in their personal development as leaders and within their organizations. And so we're so honored to welcome Jenny in our distinct panel this afternoon. And with that, take it away, Jenny.
Thank you, Wendy. Thanks for that lovely introduction. And I see my role here today is just to help attempt to keep this fabulous group of leaders on track as we go through our questions. The work that Pancho's laughing because he knows, the work that we've been doing that I've been a part of is truly led by several of the people in this circle and in this group not just through the DEI groups, but through their fabulous leadership in the community. So I'd like to welcome Zoma Maciel from the city of San Jose, Pancho Guevara from Sacred Heart Community Service, Derica Mayrens from Working Partnerships USA, and Allison Bruner from the Law Foundation of Silicon Valley. All friends, colleagues, long-term, and it's a blessing to be with you all today. So the goals of our panel today is to help other leaders and organizations like those of you out there on the webinar to understand how race equity work is important to your work and in the work you're doing to serve our community. And then also for these folks that have struggled and worked on this for many years and internally within their own organizations, to give examples from their experience about how they've been able to apply this, what they've learned, the successes, as well as the challenges that they've faced. And so we're gonna move right into the questions. We'll start with our first one. So first question is, tell us a little bit about your organization and who you serve and how you built a culture of equity internally and how that impacts and affects your work, the team your work does externally. And I'm gonna start that question with Allison. If you wouldn't mind jumping in and starting there, that would be great.
Hi, yes, thanks, and thanks for joining us, everyone. So the reason that I was asked to be on this panel is, I believe, specifically because I'm a white woman leading a social justice, and I think I can now say a racial justice organization. And I've been doing this work for a couple of decades, and we've been doing this work for a long time, helping communities of color and communities who've been harmed by systems, and yet also by systems that are supposed to be supporting and helping them, and never calling out the fact that that those systems are, and that the people who are being, the people that we are working with, that we're calling it anti-poverty work, we're calling it social justice work, but really the overlap between people who live in poverty are, there's a, you know, obviously most people are people of color. And so I think what this moment is calling for now is calling out that we are not talking about race. And what race equity is all about, and our organization started to talk about this, and I have to credit a younger generation of legal aid and public interest lawyer advocates who came into our work about 5+ years ago, who brought this conversation to us and said, we have to put race on the table, because by being colorblind and trying to talk about this in a different way doesn't ever get to the issue. And this was a hard, and has been a hard and difficult conversation. And so I had to start grappling that as a white woman running a civil rights organization, and that has been hard. And I think that was why I was asked to be on this panel, because we started that work as an organization. And what I'll say is that we have gotten started, we have done work, and we have a long, long way to go. This is lifelong work. And what I'll say is that it takes a lot of work personally, and it takes hard work. And most of the time you're not able to do it well or go very far, but we have to hold our mirrors up to ourselves, hold ourselves accountable, and have people in our lives who are going to hold us accountable as well. It also means that our organizations have to be committed to do this work internally, and also be committed to orient and reorient our work and our own funding and resources to doing this work externally, and reorienting our resources to the communities who most need this work. I'll just talk a little bit longer, Jenny, and give a couple of quick examples. Yeah. What we did is we started with an internal scan that told us what we already knew, which is we are a white-led civil rights organization with a white ED, a white management team, a white board, and of course we do have diversity in our organization, but it's not in the decision-making, and that needs to change, and that is something that we've embarked on, and I will say that we have not made a lot of progress. And that is something that I have to hold a mirror up to. What we have done is that we created a steering committee, a committee of management and staff, to drive a lot of our internal race equity work. what we have done is that we created, one of the work groups that we created was a learning and training program where we created and our team curated its own internal educational program where we created cohorts across the organization for 6 months, where the entire organization committed two hours a week to both learning about race equity and issues, both historical, our historical context, about allyship, about our own community, and about tools that we can use as public interest lawyers to advance the goals of race equity and to do our work with a race equity lens. What that did is it allowed us to level up and have a more equal understanding and vocabulary about race equity and knowledge across our whole organization. And we just launched 2 new cohorts, even remotely, which isn't as ideal as in person for all of the newer staff that have started. So I have more to say, but this is the type of work that we've tried to do internally. We have more work that we're trying to also start doing about our work with the community that's more about trying to get closer to organizers and how to work with tenants and the community members, that we need to center their voices in helping to drive the agendas that drive the work of our own organization. But more to say on that. So just trying to share some of the work that we've been doing. It's a long, hard work. Lots of mistakes that I've made, that I continue to make, but I just wanted to share where we've been so far.
Thanks, Allison. I really appreciate that. And I want to give Pancho a chance to talk about also how he's built this work at Sacred Heart. And Pancho, if you could also, and then Allison, maybe you can come back and answer this too, and others as well, as how have you funded this? How have you been able to resource this work? I think is really important too. Pancho, go ahead, please.
So I can answer the last question first. The revolution will not be funded. And so it starts with being able to be really clear about what you're here to do. And we haven't always been clear about that. So for some of you may have heard of the organization I have the honor of working at called Sacred Heart Community Service. And we've been around for 56 years. And for most of our existence, it was an organization that was really dedicated to being an effective charitable institution, meeting the needs of particularly working poor immigrant populations with dignity and compassion and respect. And I think I had the honor of joining the organization a number of years ago, and the idea that charity was going to be the answer or the response felt woefully inadequate. Like being able to meet increasing needs and not actually having a stake in the ground and working on issues of economic justice seemed to be, a huge mistake. And so we pivoted about 11 years ago, and when we started asking and talking to community and doing grassroots organizing, which is something that we had to self-fund, we had to be able to create, a team and be able to utilize and redirect resources that would typically go to things like meeting people's basic needs, but saying some of these issues need to be front and center. You're really talking about a question of power and who has power in our community, who has voice in our community, and how are we building that power collectively. And when you listen to people and say, what are they talking about? We may run the largest food pantry in the Bay Area, but when people are not talking to us about food, they're grateful for the food, but people are talking about they want to be able to live in dignity. They want to be able to have rights as individuals that are in our community, even if they are their immigration status is not one that this country looks at as people actually having any voice and power and dignity, and being able to look at those types of issues, looking at police accountability, looking at tenant rights and other types of things. And we're doing this work. And this is where the equity comes into it. We thought, and I thought, it was a giant pivot for an organization that was known for charity to be doing this work, and that was edgy enough. But it wasn't, because the more that you ask and unpack these questions, like Allison was talking about, it's not enough to talk about poverty through the lens of economic inequality. That economic inequality and what happens in capitalism is really based on a fundamentally racist, foundation. And if we're not talking explicitly about race, then we can't do it. And so, like Allison, there's a group of folks, we've had arguments within the organization. Why aren't we more explicitly talking about and engaging in race? And about 4 years ago, we had some very, very difficult knockdown, drag down conversations about what is it? And I was on the wrong side of some of these conversations. I said, I don't want to talk about it, I want to do something about it. And we had to pivot even more resources to actually look at how are we doing that, and understanding at the core of it is not about what are we doing to have a diverse site. We have a majority of our board are people of color. Our management team are largely Latinx, mostly, and most of our staff are that. And that wasn't always the case. That wasn't exactly how things, were, especially as a leadership team, as a board of directors and other things. And that's taken some time. And it's been really good. And that didn't happen because we had a consultant telling us to do it. It was something that we want to be reflective of our community and the needs of our community. And it happened more organically. But digging deeper into how white supremacy culture hits into our organization, how we understand our role and our function, we've had to really go deeper into that and say, what is our role in terms of trying to engage allies and try to engage people or co-conspirators in dismantling white supremacy? So we got support from Surge, Showing Up for Racial Justice. That is a wonderful network of folks, volunteers around the country. And we actually sponsor a South Bay chapter of Surge where white people are doing their work and some allies are doing the work. We also pivoted and changed a lot of the work that we're doing around tenant rights, immigrant rights, and looking internally at our programs about how can we understand how white supremacy culture impacts us? How can we use a racial justice lens into that work, and being able to continue to dig deeper and deeper and deeper and look at what are we doing in everything that we're doing through that particular lens. So the tenant rights is about anti-displacement work, is about the racial undertones of what's happening right now, and it's very, very clear about how things are happening. It's been amazing. It's been transformative. It's been humbling because we make mistakes every day. And the way that we're able to reach out and do things and partner with folks like Swilma, Allison at the Law Foundation and her colleagues, Derica's team and the labor movement more generally, being able to work collectively on these issues and realize that we have a lot of internal work to do. And the last component, the personal component, I think is really important. It's not when we get together, and Jenny, you referenced some of these circles of nonprofit leaders that are getting together and other folks in philanthropy and folks that are starting to have these conversations. It's not just about a place to process and impact what's going on. It's also a place for accountability, where we're challenging each other and saying, I realize that I messed up this week. I'm gonna mess up again next week. I have people it's confusing, it's crazy, it's stupid. And I have to do better again tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And I think we're feeling that. I think all of us are feeling that in terms of the reaction in the streets. Whatever we're doing is not stepping up to the moment. And we have to do better. And a new generation is pushing us. And the more that we shut up, listen, follow, and push ourselves to actually do better is something that's really critical.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate your reference to the fact that the revolution will not be funded. I do believe that the resources to do this work and to development within organizations are not in the same trajectory as the speed of the work and the need for the work to happen. Allison, I know you get major stuff around that, and I know this is a little off script, but people ask me this all the time. How do you resource the work so that it continues in your organization? And Pancho referenced the reallocation based on the values and the mission of the organization, which is certainly important, but how else might you answer that as well? Yeah,
I mean, I think that it's a complicated question, and then it's also not. Mm-hmm. I think it's one of those things where we have budgets, just like we're asking and we're calling upon like local government to do. And it's just a matter of like having the courage and putting your money where your mouth is. We have discretion and we have decision, like the people who like are on this call, most of us, like we have discretion and we have decision making. And so there is money that you can put towards the things that you think you need to do in your organization, or to get the help you need, or to do whatever you need to do to move this needle. I think at the same time, when I look back on the last few years on some of the things that have made a difference, and I will also say I don't have easy answers for this. What some of my colleagues have done, and we have some tremendous leaders in our, very tremendous leaders in my organization, it's really starting to have hard conversations with our funders. And it's about reimagining how they're funding us and what they're funding us for. And it's not about like widgets and how many eviction defense cases are we're taking, but it's about saying, what is the nature of this work, and how much of the funding that you're giving us are you going to allow us to do systems change work for? How much of that are you going to pay us to do advocacy to get eviction moratoria during this shelter in place? Because how that affects how many people of color matter, and how is that going to allow us to also do a better job of recording data, because we need to pay for that kind of work as well. Nadia Aziz, who is the directing attorney of our housing program, just told us an astonishing fact, but also not a surprising fact, that of all the calls we've been getting since the shelter in place order, I think over 60% of tenants who are calling in for assistance are Latinx. We know that that's like over twice as many as the Latinx population in our community. I think same thing, like some huge, enormous amount are women head of households. So without being able to have the tools to record that data or record which zip codes those residents are calling from, how can we tell the story? How can we tell the story of where the need really is? And then how can we then funnel the resources to where the need is? So it's about having the conversation with the funders about how they need to allow us to best spend the money, and giving us that flexibility and being able to talk about race and use it for racial justice work. That's the way to do it, because it's not some extra pot of money. It's taking the money that we need, whether your funder is a government or a foundation or contributions from donors, and we need everyone to step up. And everyone's going to talk about how we're going into a recession and everyone's belt has to tighten. No, it's quite the opposite. What we need to say is, no, you need to actually bring more money to the communities who have already been hardest hit, because we all know that if you look at who those communities are, it's communities of color. And everyone has to sacrifice who has resources, because everyone has to give something up who has privilege.
Right on, completely right on. And thank you in particular for getting to the point that this isn't a unique pot of money. This is about how we're allowed to spend the money we have to do the work that must be done. And I think that is really right on. And actually it's the perfect segue to the next question, where I'm gonna highlight some answers from Derek and Zulma, which moves into what we're dealing with right now with COVID-19 and being sheltered in place, and the impact to our ability to provide services and to the community, and who's actually being impacted. So the question is, how have you, if at all, had to pivot or adjust your engagement around equity work since the shelter in place order has gone into effect? And so, Derek, I'd love to start with you on that particular question and see where you're at, and then we'll move to Zulma to hear about the work at the city. Go ahead.
Great. And I apologize, I got kicked off earlier and I have children running behind me. You've probably seen.
This is the world we're in right now.
It's Grace.
Completely awesome. Okay, no worries at all.
So I loved everything that Alison and Poncho said. So it's a great question. How are things pivoting? What are we seeing? So first, Working Partnerships we are a nonprofit, but we were started by the labor movement 25 years ago this year, if you can believe that, Poncho. And I know you were there. Our mission really is to build the power of working class communities of color, and in this moment, double down on power building strategies for Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. The labor movement, I believe, is one of the best movements that does racial justice inherently and has a lot of flaws. The labor law in this country is explicitly had racist inclusions in it. And so, believe it or not, for those of you who don't know the history of the labor movement and the right to organize into unions, when the final National Labor Relations Act was passed, there was a concession to Southern Democratic racist lawmakers to exclude explicitly Black.
Derica, if you can still hear me, you're frozen. What you may want to do is just turn your video off. And while we'll miss seeing your beautiful face, it might at least get so that you can still answer the question with us if you can hear me still. Such a bummer. Tech is so awesome, except for when it's not, right? So Derica, we're going to come back to you. And so I'm going to move over to Zulma to answer this question, and then we'll come back. We will not skip over some of the things you're going to say. So Zulma, certainly working in the equity arena right now has been interesting in public at the city level. There's been a lot of things that have happened just in this past week and this council session. So can you speak a little bit about some of that and how you guys have pivoted around the shelter in place? That would be really great.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for inviting local government to be part of this distinguished panel. So I will answer the question, but I also feel like I need to frame why it was that we were even able to pivot during the shelter in place. And so I think it's important just to spend like a couple of minutes to talk about where the city of San Jose is related to equity work and how, because of that initial work, we were able to pivot over. So just briefly for some background, particularly for community-based organizations or partners who are not aware of some of the work that the city has done, we started this work or exploring intentionally equity work in 2017 by way of the Office of Immigrant Affairs. And the work that we were doing around access and engagement, very focused on immigrants and refugees. So we developed, for example, a language access policy that established a standard of interpretation and translation so that people could be better served in their preferred language. So it's a policy, administrative policy. We then decided, well, we have to have an implementation plan. So we trained about 1,000 people within the organization of over 6,500 people on this policy and implementation of it, as well as incorporated a piece about implicit and explicit bias. So that really was an opportunity for us to just sort of test the waters a little bit. And what we discovered was that we were just scratching the surface, and that while our intentions were good, the action on this language access policy was going to miss the mark. So it also highlighted the importance of cultural institutional change that would be required to really get people thinking differently about who we are as public servants and how our systems burden and benefit different communities. So soon after that, we found the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which is a national organization that works specifically with local governments and state governments to give us basically a framework for how to talk about race, how to lead with race, and provides a framework, really a roadmap on how we begin, not only how we do that, normalizing conversations about race, how we organize internally to be prepared to move into operational phase. So a number of things happened over the last couple of years, and conversations emerged at a very public way. So while there were just 14 of us working internally, and then we grew to, we added another 30 employees who joined the effort, we really were the only ones that were thinking about how to embed equity and the equity framework, like really bake it into the system rather than just having this as a garnish on top. And I feel the need to point this out because it's important to recognize that the equity work was born inside the organization, and it's the beginning of culture change. Culture change doesn't happen just when you're mandating things. It has to happen organically, and we're happy that there was those very difficult conversations that are still happening, but that we started a couple of years ago. And so over the last 2 years, yes, a lot has happened. A lot of this conversation has then taken place in public view. But fortunately today, I can affirm that we're headed in the right direction. And this past Tuesday, the mayor and the city council unanimously approved the creation of the Office of Racial Equity, which will set in motion the needed transformational changes that need to take place in service and with the community. So that's an exciting piece of news. It's many of us have been waiting for this opportunity, but so now I'll answer the real question about the shelter in place. So what that did is then we have this framework. This was a great opportunity for us to apply the learning, right? And so by applying the learning, we identified ways that we can work within the EOC and have some guiding principles around racial equity to think about how we respond to COVID. And some of the things that we've done are certainly has illuminated the need for better interpretation and translations in multiple languages. The way that we outreach, the way that we engage has also, brought up better conversations about that. As well as how we better serve the small businesses. How do we get that financial assistance to the people who need it the most, right? So being very targeted and intentional based on the data that we have, because the data resurfaces the facts of where the need is, but also has, it hasn't been easy because it also has demonstrated that there's a lot of information that we don't have and that we don't have the appropriate infrastructure or the data to make better decisions. So we are on our way. And I think that from the EOC perspective, we also see the next 6 months as a real opportunity to bring together a team that will help us in the recovery. And that really will be a place for us to examine how this equity framework is going to help the people who need it the most over the next 6 months.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the fight that you guys have been in and that the GARE group has done internally. It's challenging stuff. And so thank you for all that you have done in that regard. Derica has returned from technical limbo. It's really okay. This is just part of how we deal with things right now in our world. And so I want to come back to you for that question and let you finish up your answer.
Great. Yeah, the digital divide. So while I think just to understand working partnerships in some of our work. So as a community labor alliance that focuses on building the power of working class communities of color, one of our strategies is to work with the labor movement, which also it has structural white supremacy and racism baked in part because of how labor law was founded in this country. Labor law, the right to organize, was inherently a political deal that excluded explicitly Black workers. And so farm workers, domestic workers, agricultural workers were explicitly left out of that right. And so as workers organized and as the labor movement became a force in this country, they explicitly were absent. So part of our job in this moment and actually our internal racial equity frame is to build towards that vision of a just economy that not only is an economy that's not rooted in white supremacy and slavery, as Poncho talked about, but also is an economy where the democratic institutions that Black, Indigenous, and people of color have are also not rooted and excluded in white supremacy and slavery. So in the moment of a pandemic, what happens? So pretty quickly, our analysis, right, and I think we would all share this, is that the pandemic accelerated the rate at which everyday people understood that the economy isn't working. All of a sudden, you have mass unemployment. We have millions of people infected, hundreds of thousands dead, and some of the folks who could shelter in place did, but who was left on the front lines? It was many of our folks in the labor movement and in the communities that Poncho and Allison serve. So we had many of our Black workers, our immigrant workers still deemed essential, still not making a living wage, not being paid for sick days. The state only mandates 3 paid sick days for workers. There are millions of workers who don't have more than 3 paid sick days or who have no paid sick days because they were left out of that policy. And so we did 2 things probably more, but there were two important things for us when we pivoted post-COVID and shelter in place. The first was that we reorganized internally to be able to assess what work were we going to have to pause so that we could respond in the moment. We created two internal teams. One is called our POP team, Protect Our People team, and one is our Change the World team. Our Protect Our People team, we really understood that in this moment, and I think the Black Lives Matter movement on the streets further drove this home, that part of our job was to meet the most vulnerable workers where they were. And rather than going out to do wage theft, for example, and make sure that folks were processing wage theft claims, which is when their boss doesn't pay them for meals, rest breaks, or at all. They're not working anymore, many of them. We pivoted and created a partnership with the County of Santa Clara called Santa Clara County CAN, the COVID Assistant Navigation Network. Understanding that we could keep our Canvas teams employed, we could keep our folks working and pivot them from doing community outreach on other things to assisting workers who are having trouble, who need income supports and who need to access unemployment, need to access the food bank system that Poncho runs. So that was one pivot that we made, an internal assessment of how do we lead, how does our work lead with what Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities need right now? And that's what that was important. And we had to drop, frankly, other work to do that. And then on the Change the World team, we had to really, as an advocacy organization and an advocacy nonprofit, think about what is the best use of our skills and power in this moment to use the fact that the economic model unveiled shows these vulnerabilities, like no paid sick days, for example, or family leave, or even healthcare access. And so really quickly, we pivoted to work with a lot of folks on this call and others to get paid sick days in place, to protect tenants. We're working regionally now and statewide on a suite of worker protection bills that also would help workers to get their job back as their employers start to come back, because there's no guarantee that employers will call those workers back to work. And so, and I'm very happy to say one very important bill, AB 3216 by Ash Kalra, you'll recognize that name, passed the Assembly today. Thank you to everyone who helped. So I think those two things really were important pivots, and we're about understanding that what Black, Indigenous, people of color, and I will continue to use the BIPOC frame, need is what the labor movement needs, is what we need. And that our job, and my job as an executive director who is a white woman, is to muster the resources and power that we have towards that agenda.
Well said. Thank you, Derica. I really appreciate that. I want to, one of the questions that I know people are having out there, and I get asked quite a bit, have been asked to actually come in and talk to folks about, is how you're supporting people on your teams and in your work environments as they're dealing with not just the pandemic and COVID, but also the overlay of the Black Lives Matter movement and what's happening on our streets, and just the pain of all of that. And so I'm opening that to you guys. I'm not sure if there's someone who wants to start, but that's a question for you all. Maybe Poncho, I could start with you on that.
Thanks, Jenny. Easy one. No, I'll just say that this has been a really trying time, because I think, as Derica was mentioning, and Allison, so like we're all dealing with these issues about a white supremacist culture that exists in our spaces, and the ability and the capacity for us, and the time and attention it takes to just to be able to do and unpack that and work on that is exhausting, because we all work in organizations that are based on this frame that is about, keeping people down, in some cases, institutions destroying lives, and how are we able to try to be in relationship with people in a different way? And we're struggling with that. And for this moment to happen, I think a lot of folks struggled with that pivot, especially, and I'm talking about, the Fed uprising that we're in the middle of seeing, and it's And it's just really, it's a really trying time because we feel like we're in a position to work and try to lead our institutions and do the best job that we can. But this moment calls for us to shut up, listen, and be in relationship with the communities that we're here to serve, that we're here to build, to be in relationship with and touch. And that means that we really have to continue to think and dig deeper, because when I think of racial equity, it's not about having a diverse board and, having, funders that are willing to fund us, having a consultant to do a training on anti-Blackness within our organizations. It's actually about a fundamental reordering of the relationships of power and who has that. And when you look at, when I look at what's happening right now and I realize the fundamental shifts that are happening in our society that need to happen, it's because people are rising up in the streets. I will say the most important thing that happened for poverty today in the United States was the fact that a longstanding movement that's been a couple decades in the making to fight for the rights of undocumented folks, that started with a group of young people and the Dreamers, and resulted ultimately in a system not really responding, but doing a backdoor way of being able to do it, which is the DACA, program. And it was preserved temporarily today by the Supreme Court. That did not happen because it was the right thing to do. It was the just thing to do. It happened because people have been rising up and pushing for a long time. And those folks that are part of my staff that are DACA recipients, and so many of their families are reliant on, and so many of the folks that are first responders and essential workers throughout our valley and work in all of our organizations, they have just a little bit more stability and a little bit more hope. And I want to hold on to those moments of hope. So I think to answer your question, which I may have forgotten at this point, which is this moment calls on us to be able to be different. It calls on us to shut up and listen. It calls on us to be able to be in relationship with our base and talk about how are the folks that we're here to be engaged with our constituents, our clients. We refer to them as members, those that are involved with us. How are we willing to share power with them, make sure their voices are expressed throughout what we're doing? They're guiding our programs. They're involved in running our programs. We're hiring them hiring them to be our, the employees that are doing this work, whether promotoras or volunteers or coordinating or speaking up. But are we centering them and then helping them have their voice and see that the power that they have to be able to change situations in our community? And we're not as far as we should be. We like to pride ourselves as being like this amazing community that is more diverse and that's more progressive, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But it's not. We're really, really far behind. And so I think that's the first step, is kind of looking at ourselves and how much are we ceding power, whether you're a white leader or you're a leader of color or you're working in a nonprofit or funding nonprofits. What are we doing to try to make sure that we're emphasizing and centering that? And I think the best example that I've had of this was the opportunity to work with Sulma and many of the folks probably on the Zoom, when we were thinking about starting this program to provide funding to undocumented folks, because we saw this, and our partners at Destination Home and the funders that they've been assembling said, this is a really difficult situation that they're in. And how would we get money out to undocumented folks? And the knee-jerk response from an organization is like, oh, I can design a program and I'll do it, make it simple, and I'll be able to, I'll do that and I'll design it and we'll push it out there. And we've done that many times before, and we have a lot of expertise and cultural competency and other things that we talk about. But we said, let's slow down, put a time out. Sulma and I were able to, invite a bunch of different partners to some conversations and said, we want you to go ask all of your folks. And within 4 days, over 300 undocumented folks were surveyed by a handful of organizations that were able to say, how would we construct this? How would we do this? What do you want us to do? How do you want us to message this? Who are the messengers? How are you doing? And we've fundamentally redesigned what we're doing and how we're doing it. And now we have a coalition of about 70 organizations that are in direct roles of being able to distribute resources, reach out to them, message them, make them feel safe and connected. And we hope to be able to work with the same universe of organizations, not just to provide help to people, but to be able to invite them and engage them in building power and building movement and being able to do that work on an ongoing basis. And how can undocumented folks in our community of all backgrounds also be involved and engaged in this fundamental fight for survival of Black lives? The Black Lives Matter movement needs to be part of that. And how are we living in human dignity? And that intersectional approach and that invitation to action is not just about how we deliver services, but about how we think about the larger construct and what are we fighting for. So defunding the police is going to be an interesting dialogue to have with undocumented community members who are also struggling with their own issues around understanding Blackness and anti-Blackness in our own community. And it's something that we are all struggling with as institutions, as individuals and leaders, and it's messy and we're going to screw up, but we have to try.
Thank you for that, Pancho. Zulma, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I did. So this moment in time, as many challenges as there are, really has opened up the opportunity for us to talk about race like never before. And this is an opportunity for all organizations to seize the moment and to listen to the organization, people that are, to employees, to staff, to colleagues, because I think that those initial conversations are going to accelerate then what we do with those feelings, right? So just here with the city of San Jose, our city manager, Dave Sykes, is beginning listening sessions because, we're city employees, but we're also members of the community and we're also diverse. And we have an opinion and feelings and emotions about what's happening right now and the Black Lives Matter movement. Many recognize also that this is an opportunity to put, to center a community voice. And so people in the organization are thinking, gosh, how do we really do this better? Mm-hmm. And what can we do to work with foundations to make sure that we invest in power? Meaning invest in organizations who help lift community voice and leadership as drivers of change, right? Where this isn't this won't be an afterthought anymore, but just a way of doing business for all organizations, where you build organizational capacity to center community voice in everything that we do. And that's the norm, right? And where the community is the drivers of change. So I think internally, because of these listening sessions that are going to take place over the next several weeks, the introspection that's going to happen just with the workforce about their own lives and their place in the community as well as in the organization, and then opportunities to provide resources, right? So thankfully, over the last 2 years, we've curated a list of resources of videos and publications and books, and we've created an intranet site for the city, which we expect will become public soon because we want to share these resources, but it's curated pieces of information that people can begin to explore while we're in this space and maintain and sustain this moment, right? And maintain the momentum rather as we move forward. Because if we don't, it's so easy to slide back into the comfort zone and slide back into places and ways of decision making that we had before. But this has illuminated the importance of not going back and to actually rethink the way that local government is in service of community
Nice.
from the very beginning.
You're right, because systems fight to stay the same. That's just part of their nature. That's what they do. They do it at the natural level. They do it in the systems we create. And so that's very well said. I want to just take a little sidestep because I can. And I want to ask Derica to speak to the idea of power in this movement and how we're thinking of power, because power has been brought up now by several of you in your discussions about how we discuss equity and race. And Derica, do you have any thoughts or comments about how you think about power in the work that you do with your teams and with the communities that you serve?
That's a big question, Jenny, but yes, I probably have.
I always go for the gusto, Derica. Absolutely. You can do it, babe.
I mean, okay, so Power 101. Power is the ability to make change, right? The ability to resource, to get other folks to do things. In our world, power is exerted in many different ways. And I think one of the things we have to examine in our economy and down to our very institutions, organizations, and movements, and even families, is sort of how first understanding how power is exhibited, like what are the ways in which those who have the power to change things make the rules. How does that get done? And does it get done with folks or to folks, right? And when you think about racist systems and the systems of oppression, it's very important to then say to yourself, well, how is the thing that I am doing in the world, whether that is executing a program to provide services to X number of people, or it is, advocacy to pass a law, how is the way in which I am executing my work sharing power and giving power over to those who don't have it?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning it's as important the way we do the work as the outcome, right?
Right.
And so I think that, like, internally, to speak to, I talked about some of our external work. Internally, for example, we both have a union. Many of the folks on this call do too, in our staff. Very quickly after shelter in place, and then in the Black Lives Matter moment, after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we did a couple of things. One, in the pandemic moment, we activated a strong health and safety committee that's made up of not just managers, rank and file staff. People are at all different levels of anxiety around the pandemic itself and the virus, where they have it. Many have family members who've had it. People have family members who've died of it. We have immunosuppressed folks. So really needed to understand the protocols in the office, and needed to bake our protocols with all staff and with particularly Black and Indigenous staff of color. So had to do that, had to give express permission as a boss too, to understand my power as a boss to say, hey, I know some of you want to be out in the streets. Permission granted, go. Like you don't need to you don't need to ask for that. Just schedule your time, etc. So permission granted around that. And they needed to hear that, because I had to recognize my power. And I will say, I screwed up. I should have done that days before I did. And days doesn't seem like I'm that late. Let's be clear. Each week is a decade right now. This movement stuff is moving fast. And I was days late in giving permission. I was like, well, of course they can go. And there was anxiety, and I didn't see it, and I should have. So I just think, like, understanding that is really important as well.
That was perfect. That was exactly perfect. And I really appreciate how you highlighted the sort of institutional power you've been given just through your title, right? And how you deal with that as a boss, and also the power you hold as a white woman, and what that means from the privileged perspective. We have one last wrap-up question here that I'm going to ask folks. And I have been asked by the powers that be to please start entering your questions into the Q&A box, because we're going to be moving very quickly into questions and answers. And I think that what I would love to hear from each of you is your go-to resource on this thing, where you would go, not the list of the 20 things, but what is the thing that moved you the most and got you settled on this path, or that you think people should know about in this work? Zulma, I'm going to start with you. What's your go-to thing?
You had to start with me, huh? I hadn't really decided.
Or you're just in the top left corner of my screen, so that's why I started with you.
Yeah, so honestly, it's checking in with colleagues and just recognizing that we're in such a big ship right now, and that culture change is going to take a while. So those check-ins are so valuable for me, because that change happens at the rate of trust. And a lot of this is one conversation at a time. So those lived experiences with my peers and listening to those is really my my point of reference.
Thanks, Zulma. That's great. Poncho, what would you share?
I mean, I think the thing that sometimes grounds me is if I ever need to shut up and kind of remind myself and listen is the Combahee River collective statement, which is a statement from a collective of Black feminists that have been meeting together since 1974. And it's really talking about the nature of the world and how we don't always see people and how we need to, how disordered our society is. And it's always a grounding thing for me. And I'll put a copy of that into the chat box of the panelists. But I think another resource, if you want to do your own work, especially if you want to be a co-conspirator in dismantling white supremacy, if you want to be able to learn about that and learn about how to be able to do that, not only if you're white, but especially if you're white, you're welcome to come to Showing Up for Racial Justice. And it's a group of people that are doing it. We're still working, and folks are still online, and it's been really powerful in terms of being an ally and a co-conspirator over the last 3 years that they've been working, and we'd be really proud to have you. A lot of folks have benefited from that, so please join.
That's great. And just so that everyone knows, Jen will be collecting any of these resources and getting them out. And the statement Pancho referred is beautiful if you haven't had a chance to read it. Allison, what would you offer to the group?
I'm going to say two things because I'm going to try and slip in a message I wanted to try to say earlier. One is, there are so many lists, so take advantage of the list. But one is just that this was posted earlier, but the two such study sessions that the city of San Jose did, that Solma was just a huge part in curating and making happen. I would actually encourage people to take the time to listen, because it was some people from organizations nationally who spoke. And also there was some specific aspects about San Jose history that I think anyone working in our community would really benefit from hearing. So that would be a resource I would recommend taking the time to listen to. And then the second thing I would just mention is that what I'm hearing from people in my organization is that the people of color in my organization who have been heavily involved with race equity work feel very burned out. I think that we've lost really good people because of that, and that is on me, and that is a loss to our community and our organization. And I think that that is something that any of us who are white and privileged in our organizations need to be very well aware of. And it means that we have to step up even more because we have to do more of the work. And it also means that anytime that someone, a person of color in your organization or externally, is giving feedback, even if it's hard to hear, especially if it's hard to hear, it means that it's a real gift. And so it's really important to tolerate the discomfort and to really listen to what that is and go deep inside. So that would be the most important thing to listen to.
That's really perfect, Allison. And the history of San Jose Park came from the book, The Devil in Silicon Valley. So if you aren't able to access the other, you can also access that book because it was really, there was so much I didn't know. Derica, thoughts on resources or important learning moments that you'd want to share with a larger group?
I mean, I would point to a couple of things. One, Surge is amazing. Our folks have been part of Sacred Heart's Surge community, and just go, white folks. Also, if you want some technical assistance in your institution, the Catalyst Project also does anti-racist work with institutions and organizations. And I would say, I would point you to the Black-led organizations in the Valley and in the Bay Area, whether that's Silicon Valley Debug, the Black Organizing Project, the Ella Baker Center. And I encourage people to get curious about what Black folks are asking for in this moment. And if you want some inspiration about the past, the South African Freedom Charter and the Black Panther 10-point program is something everybody should read for a vision of Black-led.
Okay, cool. Thanks, you guys. And hey, huge round of applause. You can't see all the people that are applauding you right now or hear them, but we can say thanks to this wonderful panel. I know we're moving into Q&A. And so I believe, Jen Torre, are you facilitating that particular portion?
I was actually looking for questions. I haven't seen any pop up in the Q&A section yet.
Do people also could put in the Q&A just comments or things to further reference or expand upon if they want to have the panelists expand on something that would be fine too. No. Okay, well, while we're waiting, because questions can come in, I'd like to go back to the power question because I think it's a really important thing for right now. And see if there's anyone that wanted to add to some of what Derica shared and what she talked about from the panel.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
chime in.
please go ahead.
I think it's a really challenging question because I think I know all organizations struggle with this. Who has the power in your organization? Who's making decisions about things like your budget, about your staffing, about where you put things, and who's fundraising for you? Who is who's championing your work, but who's making determination about that? And I think it's really interesting right now because we're starting to see an emergence, and this is I think kind of one of the core point about racial justice for me is it's not just about diversity we're talking about, I mentioned earlier, but it's about how are we in relationship with the folks that were there to serve or work with or organize, and do they have a meaningful voice in the decision-making organization, and being able to listen to them and have a dialogue with them and put them at the center of your decisions, not on their behalf, but they're actually doing it for themselves. And I think that's the power equation that I think we're looking for. And ultimately, I'm excited about the opportunity that the city of San Jose, which we just talked about as one institution that is starting to do some of this race equity work and has been doing so. And Sulma and her team and others have been kind of part of making that happen. But how are we making sure that they're inclusive processes where people are able to be involved? Because Derica knows very, very well how hard it is to get people and motivate people to be involved in these policy and political decision-making processes when we're coming to spaces that are very difficult for them, that are set up to be oppressive and challenging. It was only a few years ago, because of Soma's work, that we actually had interpreters actually there at the dais, like to be able to answer things. We are in a Zoom moment right now where decisions are being made with public comment. There's no interpretation kind of infrastructure that exists for that. Those kind of things. We're cutting off people from being able to be part of a process.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh. See, it's not just you, Derica. It happens to others. Pancho, we'll come back to Pancho. I do have a question from Gabriella, and so I'm going to put that to the panel, and then we'll let Pancho finish up when he unfreezes. But she asks, what is the advice that you all may have to middle-level managers and staff at organizations during this time? You want to be a team player, but also true to your own values. Thoughts? Maybe Allison, I could come to you for that particular question. And then I have another question in the box too. So thoughts on that?
I mean, I don't know if I had said what I just said before that question came in, but that actually is the answer to that question. So, I mean, honestly, like I hope this is a moment that leaders are able to practice tolerating the discomfort that this moment calls on leaders, especially leaders who are white, to practice and listen. And anyway, so that's, I mean, so I would encourage middle managers and frankly anybody to challenge your leaders. And I mean, that's what I hope that my middle managers and anybody feels like they can do. I know it's hard, and I know that that's too much to ask, but that's the ones who do, I really, really try and take what they're saying to heart the best I can. And I'm trying my best to work on it, and I'm trying not to rely on them to be the only ones who are trying to guide me.
That's perfect. Thank you
with all humbleness.
Yeah, so I'm going to keep you on here because the next question is one I think you might be able to also help with. Is that some approaches that you found successful when trying to engage boards of directors and other leaders that seem resistant to bold equity work?
This is hard. This is hard, and this is really important. I think that I will say that I've lost board members and because of this, and I've also made a lot of mistakes when it's come to my board. I think it's been really good that I've lost board members because of this. I think it's been a learning process for me and for my board members in the process. I think it's part of the pain and growth that this process is. I also think that I've hurt staff members in that process, and that's been probably, I'm gonna cry, the most painful part of this. But this is a messy, hard process, and I'm making a whole lot of mistakes all the time, and I'm not acting on the urgency that I should. I am probably making the wrong. I'm probably like self-justifying as a white person all the time by thinking that right now maybe this organization needs a white leader to try and transition us to being a person of color led organization, because have a lot of lawyers from the corporate, law firm community who are white, but they are feeling like a sense of urgency right now. And I had many of them already tell me, wow, you guys have been right the last few years, and with this race equity initiative and all your systems change work that you've been talking about. So, I think we're always going to be ahead of where corporate America is, and that's the kind of board I have, unlike other community-based organizations. And maybe that's wrong. Maybe we should also I know we should be looking at changing our board to a degree, but anyway, you don't have to know so much about us. But anyway, I think that it's important to go there with your board, and I think that you have to push your board. And I think you have to have the courage just as much as every other part of running a nonprofit. And I'm happy to talk to people about how hard that is. And I need to keep pushing my board even harder than I already have.
I just want to take a moment to just sort of say out loud that Allison's tears are real. The groups I meet with, tears are frequent. That's why we have chocolate and chips and Kleenex at every meeting. And it's not meant to dilute from the pain that people of color are feeling at all. The tears are really, I think, about sort of the frustration and the pain of the learning and the constant discomfort of going through this. It takes a lot of courage to ask, board members who are white, who give you money, who connect you with people who have money, to somehow change their worldview and thinking. And that takes a lot of courage. And so I appreciate Allison's vulnerability. I appreciate her honesty in the struggle, because none of us get better at this if we don't share our challenges as well as our successes, because it is a messy path. Derica or Zulma, did you have anything you wanted to add in that vein?
Yes, I did. I think it important to answer Gabby's question about middle managers, regardless of the size of the organization. I think it's important for leadership to just listen and to provide a very safe space for people to just get some things off their chest. I mean, a lot can happen when you begin to hear people's stories and understand where people come from, because it also begins to crack open that door for staff and the rest of the organization to have these difficult conversations, but also for people, particularly Black, Indigenous people of color, to bring all of their authentic selves to the organization with their lived experience, with their perspectives on life, with, just bring all of themselves into the organization rather than, bringing in we've adopted white supremacy practices, right? Those are our behaviors. And for many of us people of color, I think that we've felt like we had to remain in the particular box in order to be accepted by people and organizations. And I think that just the first start is just creating that space to listen and to be an authentic listener without judgment. And then the other piece is that this is very difficult work. And, it took a while for people in the organization to just say systemic racism, institutional racism, all of these words that 3 years ago just were really difficult, but now it's a lot easier, right? Because you begin to normalize these conversations, and you also have a basic set of, terminology, a basic understanding of the terminology, and why it's important to begin, to lead with race.
Yeah. Thank you, Zoma. Pancho, welcome back. I made Allison cry, so you, of course, that's how it went. Bless her heart. Derica, just wanted to follow up and see if you had anything you wanted to add, and then we'll give Pancho a chance to say his last bit, and then we should be at time.
I mean, I think they said it beautifully. This is hard work. So yeah, I'll leave it there. We're almost at time. It's been really a pleasure. And Allison, lots of tears. Like, you're not alone in the tears.
Yeah, that's right, sister. You aren't.
Can I say one more thing?
Yes, of course.
Related to what Allison was saying, we have made mistakes, and we're going to continue to make mistakes. And we need to be patient with one another, because if we begin to fear even making mistakes, then we're not going to make progress. And so we, having given us the latitude to do what we think is best, and if we look back and we thought, okay, we would do it differently, but at least we're looking back, we're to assess it, but we're still moving forward and making progress on advancing racial equity.
Thank you for that. Pancho, last thing, and then the boss wants me to give it back to her. So last word.
This is a time for us to step up. This is a time for us to follow. It's a time for us to, like those of us that are in positions of leadership within organizations, even those of us that have the privilege of being in a stable position in an organization, it's a time for us to be able to work together, set aside some differences and old, issues with each other, and be able to realize that we need to find ways of working together. And I think it's a really critical time for the nonprofit sector as well, because we have to be part of the solution as we look at defunding police. If we look at different types of resources that need to go out, we're being called upon to be able to enter in those spaces, but we have to do so authentically by listening to our people. And I think that's a really critical time. So there'll be a lot more to say about that, but appreciate SPCN's leadership on this. And
You're freezing up again, Pancho. Thank you everybody. Thank you, Pancho, for those thoughts. Even though they were a little garbled there at the end, we know your heart. I'm going to hand it back to Jen. Thank you.
Allison,
Thank you.
Your incredible
I
leadership.
don't think
And
Pancho
even
can hear us.
Jenny, sort of.
It's catching up. Thank you so much, Jenny, and to all of our panelists. This conversation is just a very powerful and dear conversation close to my heart. I really appreciate all of you really leveraging your power and privilege to move equity work forward. I know that it's hard. I know that it is a really tough road. So I appreciate all of you engaging in this conversation and the work that you're doing every day. So please, everybody who's on, give them a round of applause. The show is not over yet. I just have some very important things to share with all of you. So again, I want to thank our sponsors for continuing to support us in this virtual summit. And I want to let everybody know what's coming up. For those of you who have not yet seen it, SVCN and Cadre, we are putting on a series of workshops to support nonprofits in reopening. The next session is on June 23rd at 1 o'clock. That one will be a deep dive into space planning. A deep dive into space really is what I like to say. The third session will be on July 7th, and we'll focus on supporting your staff and your workforce during a time of crisis. We all know that there's a lot going on, so please join us for that. And then I want to also recognize that it's Pride Month, and we are going to celebrate Pride at the close of the month on June 30th with a workshop sponsored by the County Office of LGBTQ Affairs. Come join us and learn about the basics of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, and how to support the LGBTQ community. That'll be June 30 at 10 a.m. And then we are still also trying to get a complete count for the census. If you are not aware, the census can really help to fund a lot of the services that are being provided during times like this. So we've got some specific workshops for those frontline staff and people who are going to be interacting with our hard to count communities. The first session that we're offering for this specific type of staff will be on July 10th, and that'll be in the morning. We're also going to offer an evening session on July 16th for those of you who can't make it during the day. Please check those out. And then if you haven't seen it, SBCN and Thrive Alliance for Nonprofits has released an equity statement, or statement of solidarity. So this is just the start of us building a DEI resource page. And Wendy, I believe, is going to launch a poll for all of you to let us know what is it that you want in terms of support when we do roll out our equity page, our DEI page. And so go ahead and let us know what are the things that you really want to see by filling out this poll. And we will take note of what you want and be sure to include it so that we can support all of you in our nonprofit community with the tools and resources that you need in order to carry your equity work forward. And I will go on to the next slide while the rest of you are filling this out. Just so you're aware, I think you might have all heard about our Funding Your Impact Summit. We are going to take it virtual this year, of course, given the times. And we want you to save the dates. So it'll be a weekly series just like this one. It'll start on Thursday, August 6th. It'll be at 10 o'clock this time. Registration information will be posted on our website, as will all of the workshop links. So you can register for anything and everything on sbcn.org. And if you want to be a speaker, let me know and I can get you the speaker call to speakers to fill out. And another thing is, if you're not yet a member or if it's time to renew your membership, please do so. Check out our new membership structure. We have a new feature called Ally Membership for those of you who are not necessarily running a nonprofit organization. We definitely need each other now more than ever. So sbcn.org to renew or join SBCN today. And lastly, meet our team. You can reach out to the SBCN cadre team at any time. This is a list of who you can reach out to and all of our contact information. I will include everything that was discussed today, including resources, answers to all the questions, and contact information for SBCN and cadre in my follow-up email. And don't forget to fill out your evaluation. It'll pop up when I end this webinar. So thanks to all of you, and please have a safe and healthy rest of your week.